It's quite an entrance. It was a little more than 75 years ago when Secretary of State George Marshall proposed in a speech at Harvard University that the United States provide economic assistance to restore economic infrastructure of post-World War II Europe. This idea, later known as the Marshall Plan, had the most profound effect both in Europe and in the United States. Now, as we live in the aftermath of the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan, the beginning of the first war in Europe since World War II, what lessons can we draw from the Marshall Plan when considering America's role in the world? As Americans and as people of faith, what are the ethical implications of what we did then and what we are perhaps being called to do today? My name's Randy Hollerith. I'm the Dean of Washington National Cathedral, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for this important conversation where we can address these and many more questions. I am especially grateful to the Cathedral's canon historian, Jon Meacham, for having the inspiration for this evening's program and for bringing together our distinguished panelists. While you have their full biography in front of you, we are so pleased to have on the platform this evening not only the award-winning historian and author Jon Meacham, but we are thrilled that he will be joined by author and foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Post, David Ignatius, the president of the German Marshall Fund, Heather Conley, and last but certainly not least, Joe Scarborough, attorney, political commentator, former congressman, and currently the host of Morning Joe on MSNBC. Would you please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists?
Thank you, Dean. You all should know that starting tomorrow, Mika has ordered that an organ overture begin every program. We're going to start with "Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past" and see if Willie Geist actually knows any hymns. So that's coming up soon. Thank you, Reverend Dean. I'm now requiring Scarborough to call me Canon, so it could get ugly very, very soon. I want to start with the Truman biographer and then move to the right. Joe, put us in the summer of '47. What's on Truman's desk? What's General Marshall thinking about? What is the atmosphere in the White House as this program takes shape?
Well, what really starts the crisis that begins Truman and Atchison, Marshall, everyone else starting to move quickly is a telegram that arrives at the White House basically saying, sorry, the British economy has collapsed. We can no longer help. There's a crisis in Greece, there's a crisis in Turkey, and you're going to have to go it alone. And at this point, Truman, who I still think the most extraordinary thing about Harry Truman is who he surrounded himself with. Here you have a guy who graduated, I think, from Rawlings Commercial College, a high school degree, had really no one expecting that he would be a successful president, but he had the confidence to surround himself, I believe, with some of the greatest statesmen, diplomats, from Atchison to, of course, George Marshall and George Kennan. So they were faced with this crisis, and it's so interesting. I decided to write the book on Truman and saving freedom because at the time I thought America was turning its back on the post-war order that Truman and Atchison and Marshall created. And I look at what's happening today. I see Republicans and Democrats alike coming together to push back, to contain Russia, once again, using NATO. And I think there's some extraordinary parallels. I think, though, the main difference is that Republicans have actually been far more cooperative in 2022 than they were in 1947. The first meeting when Truman scrambled, the first meeting at the Oval Office, was bringing Republican leaders over. The problem is they forgot to invite Mr. Republican, Senator Taft, who was an avowed isolationist. Vandenberg was there. They had a very skeptical audience. And you know, this is one of the things about George Marshall, who George Marshall was a giant in Washington, an absolute giant in Washington. He was revered by Harry Truman, revered by official Washington, and he was a man who really, he saw his call to duty above mere partisan politics, almost like a Queen Elizabeth type figure. He never voted. He thought that a soldier shouldn't vote. His father didn't vote. And one of the stories that show how confident Marshall was one time FDR was in his office, and FDR loved having people around to agree with him all the time. And he turned to George Marshall after making a point. He said, "Don't you agree, George?" And General Marshall said, "No, Mr. President, I don't agree with you at all." And everybody in the room was horrified. FDR never called George Marshall by his first name again. But actually, as the war came about, he promoted Marshall over more senior members of the military and always trusted him to speak straight. So you had these extraordinary people around, but interestingly enough, Marshall was not as intimately involved with sort of the creation, the development of the Marshall Plan, but he was the only person that could sell a program that actually $15 billion, which would be $150 billion today in US dollars, but I think more stunning, it was 5% of America's GDP. So they had a real sales job. And it was Arthur Vandenberg, a former isolationist from Michigan, who actually was sold at that meeting in February to support the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan in time, and move to a position where Stalin was isolated in Eastern Europe.
Heather, same kind of question. What is unfolding in Europe on the ground as America, as Joe says, prepares to give 5% of the GDP to several former foes?
Well, exactly as President Truman was getting the message from the UK that they could no longer support Greece and Turkey, Secretary Marshall was receiving very dire dispatches from Rome, from Paris. To set the stage, 1947 was a devastating year. It was one of the most frigid winters on record. Spring flooding had destroyed a lot of the early harvest planting. Europe had not recovered from the devastation after the Second World War. And this desperation was allowing communist influence to grow, particularly in Italy and in France. And the dispatches were getting more dire. And Secretary Marshall understood that something had to be taken, some action had to be taken, hope had to be delivered. But exactly, Joe, as you were saying, the best and the brightest were at the State Department. The economists, they were collecting this data. Marshall wanted to know how big of the problem, how big the solution that it needed to be. And the economists were working so hard to figure this out, to understand the scale and the scope. But you're absolutely right. Truman, what I loved about Truman, you know, most people, this big plan, they would have called it the Truman Plan.
Right.
But Truman said, "Oh dear God, don't call it after me. Call it after the most popular man in the United States. Call it after George Marshall, which told you he was about getting it done.
Right.
He was about moving that needle forward. So there was absolute desperation. And I think in many ways, Marshall's story began in April of 1947 when he traveled to Moscow to see Stalin one last time. Of course, Marshall knew Stalin very well throughout the war. He thought he had a relationship. He thought he could try to turn Stalin a little bit from, going back to that sort of grand bargain during the Second World War. And he left Moscow after meeting with Joseph Stalin for several hours, understanding there could be no more in that direction. And he knew he had to save the difficult gains during the Second World War. Something massive had to be done, and he really staked his political, using all of his great popularity and his political sense, but driving the US government to do something very big and receiving Truman's confidence to deliver that. I'm not sure Truman knew he was going to deliver the speech he necessarily delivered on June the 5th at Harvard. It was a short speech, something like 13 minutes. He delivered the punch, and everybody knew they had their marching orders from the general, and it was time to try to put that plan into action.
David, the tension that both Heather and Joe mentioned between our capacity to recognize a problem that both has a humanitarian element, but also our own security, our own self-interest, sheds light on this perennial tension between our sense of ourselves as an indispensable nation and our corresponding tendency to be isolationist. And much of American history, of course, is bouncing between these two things. Where do you think we were in the late 40s, and then run us up to right now in terms of the isolationist, indispensable thermometer?
So my sense, I was born in 1950, is that the generation that had fought the war came home, wanted to get married, live a normal life, forget about the difficulties of the war, and get on with it. And there is an American sense, let's retreat into this big, beautiful country and let the rest of the world deal with its own problems. And I think Truman's greatness and Marshall helped him. As a man of the heartland, simple man, as Joe said, understood that America had to be involved in the world and helped lead this process of commitment, going from the Truman Doctrine on to, amazingly, sounding in my pocket as this air raid siren from Kyiv.
You need to explain that.
So,
Just returned from Ukraine.
that is literally an app that I had for my trip to Ukraine that has the air raid siren before it. So something bad is happening in Kyiv as we speak. I should just say, talking about that generation, that one of the people in the audience on June 5th in the Harvard Tercentenary Theater, I think they call it, John, was my father, who's sitting in the front row, who's going to celebrate his 102nd birthday. And my dad, like most of the people there, heard this speech by General Marshall, who my dad says wasn't really the most famous, glamorous person there. T.S. Eliot was getting an honorary degree. Omar Bradley, is that right? So it was not a speech that people saw as history-making. But the astonishing thing to me as I study this period is how quickly this came together. We're used to policy making being this delayed, laborious process that goes back and forth from NSC committee to agency to endless struggle to coordinate and move. As Heather said, Secretary Marshall went to Moscow in April. He realized something urgently needed to be done to deal with the Soviets, that Stalin wasn't backing down. In late April, he went to George Kennan, who was running his policy planning staff. A month later, Kennan delivered the outlines of what would become the plan that Marshall announced the next month on June 5th. I mean, incredible. Think of the speed of that. That it took George Kennan a month to draft this and get this back to the boss. So, you know, John, it was a time when every part of our history would have led you to think that America was going to pull back, and we didn't. That tension is present. Certainly after the wars in the Middle East, many Americans have wanted to pull back. That's one of the things behind the rise of Donald Trump. I feel that the bipartisan support that Joe described for what we're doing in Ukraine is just a wonderful reaffirmation to the world that America isn't in retreat from its responsibilities, that the spirit that people associate with us, but with that moment that we're celebrating tonight, is still present. I said a few years ago that, you know, as Ashton said, he was present at the creation. I felt we were present at the destruction. I don't feel that anymore. I feel we're present at the reconstruction, and that's great.
Yeah.
So in 1943, and Mr. Ignatius might have been there too, Churchill came to get an honorary degree at Harvard, and he gave a speech in which he said, "The price of greatness is responsibility. You cannot come across the mountains and become the most powerful nation in the history of the world," which he called us in 1943, without being involved in the world's causes, affected by its agonies, and inspired by its hopes. And to a large extent, it seems to me that the Marshall Plan, outside of the Second World War itself, is the fullest embodiment of our paying the price of greatness. Do you think the world, oftentimes when you help someone, they don't particularly love being reminded that they were helped? There's something in the Bible about that, I think. So, Heather in particular, do you think the world in that period looked to America with gratitude or ambivalence, some mix of the two?
I think particularly Europe looked at the United States in some ways in awe, in gratitude. It was the only power that could deliver that hope that the Marshall Plan remained. And even the United Kingdom, Foreign Secretary Bevins was the first to say after Marshall delivered his Marshall speech that it is the great hope, only the United States could deliver that. I think because there was such desperation and we were the only ones that could do it, that in itself was our power. I think also, as we think about even following the Marshall Plan, we're getting ready to celebrate next year the 75th anniversary of the Berlin Airlift, that again the United States was called upon to deliver needed supplies to a cut-off Berlin. And what do we remember? The candy bomber delivery, the candy to the children. Those are the stories. That is the gratitude. And just a small story about the German Marshall Fund. It was at the 25th anniversary of the Marshall speech that then a German chancellor, Willy Brandt, followed Marshall's footsteps and gave a speech, and with great gratitude thanked the American people and actually created the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We are a gift of gratitude to make sure that we are the living memory of the Marshall Plan. That's our job, to give hope to others, civil society, and in some ways 25 years later, that gratitude continues to be expressed. And I think it was Truman, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, that said the United States, this was the Marshall Plan was the one moment when we turned around against our enemy and turned around and provided humanitarian assistance to West Germany 2 years later. The Marshall Plan was open to all European countries, both those that were controlled and influenced by the Soviet Union and Western Europe. Stalin refused that aid. Because what did he know? Because with hope and America's promise of a better tomorrow, that will always beat the darkness of communism and authoritarianism. It ended up going to 16 European countries. And that hope, that to me is the United States and our leadership. We do it imperfectly, but we are that beacon of hope. And the Marshall Plan crystallized that delivery of hope.
And we still are today. And Meek and I often have debates about where America is today. In our home, of course, not on TV. We always agree on TV. I think the United States now is doing extraordinary work for the world. You just visited Poland and just visited Mika's brother, Mark Brzezinski, who's ambassador in Poland. Mark told me early on, when American troops first started coming in, the Polish people just approached them and hugged them. And they were thinking, my God, the Calvary has arrived. What we have been through as a country, what the Germans did to us, what the Soviets did to us, what Putin wants to do to us, it's just extraordinary. And then my 18-year-old daughter worked a month over in Poland this year. And it's very easy to be very cynical about the United States if you watch news programs like ours. And Kate could not believe where the United States was, what the United States was doing in Poland, in Ukraine. She would see Ukrainian citizens coming into Poland, and they would ask her, are you an American? Are you? And there was an extraordinary sense of gratitude, and she called me after working at the border for a week, and called me and she said, Dad, we are everywhere. Our country is everywhere. It is amazing the impact America has, which sometimes, again, we don't understand that. I've always been so surprised since going on TV, the people that come up to me and talk about how great America is. It's usually immigrants who come here and they all say the same, you don't understand that you are, we're in the church, so I can quote Sermon on the Mount. I do it on my show anyway. That we're a city on the hill for all the world to see. It's extraordinary what we're doing right now in Ukraine. And it's not just the weapon systems that we're sending to Ukraine. I think the untold story, David knows this so much better than me, is the training. U.S. troops, what we have trained the Ukrainians to do since their failures in 2014. I think that's really the untold story, isn't it, David? How extraordinary. We have gone through so much since 9/11, and there have been tragedies in Iraq and Afghanistan, but over the past 20 years, we have learned how to fight in urban settings, urban warfare, and we learned to train the Ukrainians in a way that I think is the real difference maker.
I think Joe's absolutely right. I've talked with the just retired head of Special Operations Command, General Clark, about how serious our special forces soldiers, some of our very finest, have been about this mission since 2014 to create a world-class special forces capability in the Ukrainian military. And you're seeing that at work now. We're going to see it even more as this war goes forward. You would not want to be a pro-Russian Ukrainian in these occupied areas. You're going to go to bed every night worried, and that's as it should be, I think. So we've helped them a lot. The Ukrainians, just been there, say something that I hope will reassure Americans, but also challenge us. We don't need your troops, they'll say. We have learned over these 8 months of horror that we can fight for ourselves. We need your weapons, and we need your money, and we need your bipartisan, unflagging support, but we'll do the fighting. And you know, it's a rare ally that is prepared to say that. As Joe says, we've done a lot behind the scenes in a lot of areas that I don't know much about, but you know, in the areas of cyber and other intelligence matters. But just to summarize what it was like to be there last weekend, it's bracing, it's stunning to see people who have that level of commitment. I wrote yesterday that it's like what I imagine people felt when they were in London meeting with Londoners during the Blitz. This absolute refusal to be cowed, intimidated. Putin's threats of nuclear war led people to joke about how they were going to head to a mountaintop and have a party if they heard the news. I mean, you know, they're in this all the way. There's no turning back for them, and we're lucky to have them as partners.
Yeah. Joe, you grew up in both the Southern Baptist tradition and the Episcopal tradition, and there's a battle between the two, I know.
Yes.
We would like to think we're winning, but there are only 6 of us, so our armies are a little depleted, and they're all here.
Well,
yeah, exactly.
I'm actually converting an Eastern European Catholic to the Episcopal Church.
We're very excited about that, because Mika would be the only recorded case of someone boarding a sinking ship. So thank you. We're very excited. But talk about the role of faith in foreign policy in the 20th century. It's not perhaps a predominant force, but it is certainly part of the arena of factors that have led us to make certain decisions.
Well, I remember being at the University of Alabama and Dr. Chotner talking about the reasons why Americans supported Israel, and she listed several, and she said why some people even support Israel because of their religion. Sort of laughed, evangelicals. And I remember after getting elected, I went to speak to an AIPAC meeting in Fort Lauderdale, and they despised me. They despised Newt Gingrich. They despised the right-wing Republicans, and were talking about the religious fanatics. And I said to them, you don't understand. We learned from the time we're 5 in Sunday school that if we don't support Israel, we're going to hell. So we're on your side. So I think though you look at what we've done uniquely as a country, beyond that, talking about whether it's the Marshall Plan, whether it's the extraordinary humanitarian work we've done across the globe. I mean, America has fed and freed more people than any country in the history of the planet. That goes back to the teachings of Christ. I'm reading this extraordinary book called Dominion. And in it, the author's a historian who says so many of the things that we do. People who say, I'm an atheist. I'm just guided by morality. I'm not guided by the church. I don't need the church. So much is actually guided, whether they know it or not, by what they've grown up with. And that is Jesus talking about, in Matthew 25, giving a cup of water to the thirsty, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, bringing hope to the hopeless. charity was actually something that was seen as a weakness in Roman times, in Greek times. It is, and so I really do believe, in large part, that faith has guided this humanitarian impulse. And you look again at all the things that we've done, especially since in the post-war world. I think faith's been inseparable. By the way, I had COVID, and Mika told me I could say this, and I've been hit with fatigue for about 20 days. And let me tell you something, COVID fog, it's real. And I just showed you. No. I had a great point to make.
It'll come back. It'll come back.
It'll come in a couple of weeks. But you get the point.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So every action has a reaction. George Marshall, whom we commemorate and celebrate this evening, was attacked as in print in 1954 when Robert Welch published a book called The Politician, which was an attack on Dwight Eisenhower for being, quote, a conscious agent of the communist conspiracy, which led to the creation of the John Birch Society, which, if they had had access to the internet, would have been more in the QAnon world. They only had a mimeograph, so it was somewhat limited, but still, you and I grew up in a world where there were some Birchers.
Yeah.
Talk about, David, we'll start with you. Talk about action and reaction. And each of you has made the point that this is an hour where the United States has met an obligation in standing up for the rights of a weaker state, seemingly weaker, against aggression, trying to push back against a Hobbesian world. Yet, there are very loud voices that are supporting Russia and not Ukraine, who are very close to the former President of the United States, and a huge part of the base of one of our major parties seems enthralled to the aggressor and not a defender of the victim. So how worried are you that this is an elusive moment of American engagement? Or am I too negative?
If we'll have to wait and see. If Trump comes surging back, becomes president again, this moment of American re-engagement, recreation, will vanish, and will be the country once again that Europe was terrified we were becoming. I hope that isn't going to happen. Let me just say, on the question of action and reaction, the most difficult question that I struggled with during this trip that I just finished to Ukraine was the one we all think about. How will this war end? And I found myself asking Ukrainians again and again, is your enemy Putin or is it Russia? And it's painful for me to say that to a person, the answer was Russia. That this is deeper than just Putin. That Russia's gone a different way. Russia's the country that's supporting Putin. And so I'm left with this quandary, which I'll just share with all of you. For me, the 20th century has two overwhelming lessons. The lesson of the end of World War I is the danger of a punitive peace that's imposed on the defeated country. I think historians would agree that the demand for German reparations brought on Hitler and the nightmare of World War II. But a second lesson, which is very applicable to this moment, is that without unconditional surrender of the adversary, of the country that's doing all this harm, real reconstruction is impossible. And that's the point that my Ukrainian contacts last weekend kept saying again and again. Without a period like that, like what Germany went through after World War II, we are not going to get past this. We're just going to postpone it. And it's not directly responsive to your question, John, but I hope that that's the action-reaction dynamic that I'm worried about most.
But David, aren't you afraid also at some point the Ukrainians' goals and ours are going to diverge? You know, because you even look back at the history of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had checks and balances with the Politburo when he was seen as becoming too dangerous and unstable. They held him in check. There's nobody to do that for Vladimir Putin. I do think these are dangerous times, and I think at some point what I fear is our self-interest and the Ukrainian self-interest, they're going to diverge.
Well, we have an interest in avoiding World War III, and I think President Biden is right to keep stressing that, and to say again and again, we will avoid, if at all possible, any direct confrontation with Russia. But we are getting to the point where the stakes keep being raised, and the Ukrainians, I'll just quote what one very senior official said to me this weekend. We have partners and we have allies. America has been a wonderful partner, supplying us with the weapons that are helping us survive against this attack. We wish you were allies. Mm-hmm. And that haunted me.
Yeah.
I think, John, keeping the sort of bringing those two questions together about faith, and what comes to me, the words of the late Senator Jon Meacham about keeping the faith with the oppressed, those that were behind the wall. He was speaking of the Cold War. And this keeping the faith with the Ukrainian people at this moment, I don't think our interests are diverging. I think we share the interests of territorial integrity and sovereignty. I think where we diverge is in the costs that we are willing to bear. The Ukrainians are willing to bear all costs. This is existential to them. Mm-hmm. We have to decide what is the cost that we are willing to bear for that. And this, in many ways, gets back, if I may, to the Marshall Plan. It was not a done deal after that June 5th speech, even though George Marshall was very popular. There was a lot of resistance to all the things we hear today. Why are you sending $40 billion worth of aid to Ukraine? We need it here. We're hurting at home. And there's absolute truth to that. And I think that's sort of the traditional, in some ways, isolationism, but also understanding, let's help our needs before we help others. But at the same time, a Republican, Arthur Vandenberg, worked with the Democratic administration, and George Marshall went out, they needed a Marshall Plan to sell the Marshall Plan. They went to the Iowa Corn Exchange. They talked to every Rotary Club that would sit and listen to them. Senior government officials went out into the heartland and say, this is why this is important. This is why we have to sacrifice, because there's a cause greater than self. And that's what we have to keep faith with. Many of you will remember with the Baltic states who prayed for captive nations in their schools. We kept the faith. That's the city on the hill. And we have to, though, keep faith with the American people to explain ourselves why this is important, why tax dollars are going. There's something greater than ourselves here. That's the mission. I think that's what we're falling down on a little bit. I think you explain to the American people, and I see Ukrainian flags fluttering not only in cities but in towns that I would consider bastions of republicanism. So there's something there to work with. But finally, what concerns me about some of the rhetoric that we're hearing, and this gets to your question about the far right, it's understandable understandable about isolationism, questioning the use of funds here. I think what we're hearing now on some is this attraction to strong leadership, authoritarianism, that the world is bad and that darkness is coming, and you should go with that. And quite frankly, it is startling to see many political candidates that are absolutely using word by word Russian disinformation right now. And that's where we need to dig deep and talk about keeping the faith with our own American interests and not reflecting a disinformation from an adversary.
There is a direct line from some of my friends, former fellow Republicans. I would say of them, former conservatives. They would say of me, former conservative. There is a direct line from, for them, supporting Donald Trump, to Orban, to Putin. And we saw it with the CPAC tweet that was up for 12 hours. That echoed Russian disinformation. I wasn't surprised because Matt Schlapp, who I knew very well in the Bush administration, I remember visiting him in the White House. I said, he's a little too much of an establishment guy for me. I mean, I liked Matt, but he was a Bushy. His wife was a Bushy. They were all in for George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. But again, they're celebrating Orban. It is this embrace of authoritarianism, of illiberalism. I am not, again, perhaps I'm Pollyannish, I'm not quite as concerned because as disturbed as I was by Donald Trump's actions, as disturbed as I was by how he handled himself at G20 summits and on the world stage, I remember at the same time that Republicans and Democrats in the Senate alike were passing the toughest sanctions on Putin. Then at the same time, Donald Trump would say something absolutely reckless. His vice president, Mike Pence, would go, I think it was the Baltic states, and deliver a line-by-line recitation of what Ronald Reagan said in the 1980s about the evil empire. So I think we need to remain vigilant. I do agree with you. We need to do a better job of explaining why this is so important, not just to the American people, but to Europe and to the world. And you know, our concept in the battle really between Western civilization and this illiberalism. But I think sorry, dear, I think we're winning. I think we're winning. I know you don't believe me. I think we are. I remember when Mark decided to go to Poland. I said, when the president asked Mark to go to Poland, and he said I said, Mark, you do understand. You're on the front lines now, representing the United States in the fight between Western democracy and illiberalism, Putin's illiberalism and Orban's illiberalism. And just look at Poland. The change since the beginning of this war, how clarifying this has been. You know, Vladimir Putin's approval ratings in the Republican Party, my former party, had actually gotten up, I believe, into the 40s before this war. It's like at 1 or 2% now. So there have been so many tragedies since February, but it has been a defining time as well, much like 9/11. And I think we are stronger as a nation for it. And my God, what example. The Ukrainians, what example. Yeah. What examples.
Be brave like a Ukrainian.
Be brave like a Ukrainian.
Yeah, okay, great.
Exactly.
We're going to have some questions from you all.
Hey, if you want to raise your hand
Margaret
if you have
will.
a question in the audience.
Margaret is the Oprah of the evening.
All right. National Cathedral.
Yeah, hi. Great discussion and some very great points there, and reinforcing something that David said, if you would, and I've read several of your books and avid reader of your column, but the question that you just posed to Ukrainians about Putin or Russians, and they said to a person, Russian, I'd love to see that elaborated upon. What is it that the Russians represent that bothers Ukrainians, and I guess vice versa. What is it that Ukraine, obviously they're breaking away from the mold, but I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, just briefly, and if you want to read a detailed version of this, you can go online tonight because I wrote this during the day. So, as Ukrainians explained it,
And leave a positive comment,
please.
on the site.
After the fall of the Soviet Union and communism in 1991, Russia and Ukraine diverged paths. In the 90s, it seemed like they were going down the same path with corrupt, kind of freewheeling, whoopee capitalism. But that period was, for Russia, very painful. It really was a period of chaos. And Putin came in 2000 as president, and Russians were glad of it. They were glad that this pretty alcoholic president who just let the oligarchs run wild had been replaced. Ukrainians continued with a passion, moving toward the West, hoping to join the European Union, hoping also to join NATO. And I'll just mention one of the most interesting conversations I had about this phenomenon that we're now watching the results of was with Mika's father, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in 2008 when we were working on a book together. And he made the point repeatedly that the reason it was so important for us to support Ukraine, because already Putin was beginning to, bang the drum about pulling Ukraine back. The reason it was so important for Ukraine to join the EU, maybe then to join NATO, was that this Western Ukraine would pull Russia west. That it was our best chance for pulling that other culture towards the kind of Western, Russian history, as we all remember from school, is the story of that tension between its European leanings and its kind of Asiatic, different culture. So Zbig, Mika just was so passionate that this was crucial. When I saw your brother last week in Warsaw, I thought, among many things, how proud your dad would have been to see him now, trying to lead that effort to stand with Poland, to pull these countries toward the kind of values that we all, I think, dream about.
Question, you can raise your hand.
Ooh, one in the back.
Thank you all. Could you talk about the impact of all the things you've been discussing from the Asian perspective? What's being thought about this in Beijing, Tokyo, et cetera?
I'm happy to start that. You're absolutely right. Since February 4th of this year, right before the Winter Olympics, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met and agreed to an unlimited or no limits partnership. And this, strategically for the United States, is a nightmare because Sino-Russian a condominium against the United States, against the West, poses enormous strategic challenges. We sense that Putin did tell Xi Jinping that he would invade Ukraine, again, full-scale invasion, but it would be very quick. Again, his plan A was 3 days and decapitation. Of course, that's not the plan. So when Xi Jinping and Putin met a week and a half ago in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, there was a little coolness in the language. Putin was explaining to Xi Jinping some of the challenges, so we're watching this relationship very closely. Right now, Beijing is fully supportive of, rhetorically, of Vladimir Putin. Both Xi Jinping and Putin believe that the West is in irrevocable decline. This is their moment to secure their own historical legacy. They both have a grievance-based victimization approach to their leadership. But China has been very careful not to run afoul of US or European sanctions, particularly financial sanctions. So our sense is that while rhetorically Xi Jinping is very supportive of what the Russians are attempting to do, he doesn't want that splatter effect, certainly to harm the Chinese economy as he prepares this coming week for the 20th Party Congress, something that will anoint him for a third term and basically Xi for life at this point. But watching this dynamic is very, very important. The other element we're not doing as well is really our messaging, particularly in Africa, the Western Hemisphere we call the Global South. This is where Russian disinformation has been incredibly potent, and we don't have a good answer for that. So we really, I think the United States has to really rethink its own diplomatic and economic presence. We have to fight in some ways for the countries that are wishing to sit on the sidelines, take from all sides, and just remain self-interested. We have to get them off the sidelines a little bit and very much focused on territorial integrity and sovereignty. So the geopolitical plates are shifting quite dramatically. I share your optimism. I think we are in a strong place. But quite frankly, for too long, we were a little bit lazy and sitting on the side and thinking things would sort of just roll our way. We've got to roll up our sleeves, think strategically, work very hard every single day, and hopefully we can get our confidence back. And that was the Marshall Plan. In some ways, we did it. We can do great and big things again and sort of restore our confidence. So
I will say the actual summit between Putin and Xi was interesting, and what Putin was saying, stammering around a bit, explaining the war. What Xi did not say, but afterwards the statement put out by Xi's government was fascinating. It was not as direct as what Modi would say to him or what Erdogan would say over the next few days, but it wasn't positive. And I actually do think that there has been, you're right, I think there's been an incredible shift brought about by this war. The way now, obviously, that Russia looks at the world, the way China looks at the world. I will say, if this were going to be a 3-day war, Xi would be perfectly fine with it. But make no mistake of it, once again, bringing up Mika's father, not just because she's my wife and I get extra points for bringing up her father. But at the start of this war, I went back and started reading some of his books from the early 1980s. You could lift passages from what he wrote about the Soviet Union in 1993 to what Vladimir Putin was doing in 2022, talking about, as you said, a foreign policy based on grievance, a foreign policy that has absolutely no political appeal to the rest of the world, a foreign policy that depended on doing one thing, disrupting a world order that the United States of America dominated. That is a singular focus. It was a singular focus of the Soviet Union in the 80s as they saw their decline coming. It's Putin's singular focus. If you've ever heard Sergei Lavrov speak, the bitterness and resentment is just dripping from every word. How does this separate Russia from China? China, going to bring up your dad again, since January of 1979, when they normalized relations at a dinner at a certain farmhouse in McLean, Virginia, the Chinese have wanted to dominate the world order. They have spent the last 40 years with that singular focus in mind. So the Russians, in their weakness, in their attempt to disrupt the world order with nuclear blackmail, with disinformation, is actually counter to what the Chinese want to do, which is to dominate that world order. This disruption, this anarchy, this chaos is not good for the Chinese. She has so many problems right now. I think it's the most underreported story. I think on the foreign policy level over the past year, we have built up China over the past 15 years like we built up Japan in the 1980s. The Japan that could say no. The Japan we heard that was going to turn America into its granary. The America that would be dependent on the Japanese for all of their computer chips, that we wouldn't even be able to launch our nuclear weapons. They would fall harmlessly into the sea because we were so dependent on Japanese technology. We've heard the same thing about China. And we're seeing, I believe, a real change. One mistake after another by Xi over the past several years. One unforced error. One final thing really quickly. We have allies? No. We have partners that we have to do a much better job with, that are right now voting present in the United Nations, that need to be voting to condemn Russia. But we have to convince them that we're not taking them for granted, that we need them on our side, and that the future does not lie in Beijing or Moscow, that it's being our partners, being our allies.
And one thing that links what Joe's saying is what the president talks about a good bit, which is this competition between democracy and autocracy. And if Ukraine prevails, and if we can actually keep our republic, as Dr. Franklin said, then that's affirmative proof that the messiness of democracy is in fact resilient enough to stand up against autocrats.
John, I don't have a question.
But you got a great voice.
Yes. He's got a great voice.
Brief comment on the speech. Marshall wrote a short note to President Conley saying, I hope you will understand that I don't intend to make any kind of speech except to acknowledge the great honor that you have conferred upon me with the award of this degree. And so that was his approach to it. One thing you could say about Marshall, he wasn't a great orator, and most of the people in the yard that afternoon failed to see the real full implications of what he was saying. Even President Conley himself acknowledged that he didn't see the full implications of what George Marshall was saying. The other comment I'd make is that in the morning exercises, which were really spectacular, the honorary degree to George Marshall was that there was only one comparison in our nation's history of a soldier and a statesman to whom General Marshall could be compared. He obviously had George Washington in mind.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. Thank you. I think we know a place to stop when we find one. Thank you. That's marvelous. Congressman, thank you.
Thank you, constituent.
Correspondent, thank you. Everyone go read David's column. Click on it a lot. It'll help him.
My thanks to all of you joining us tonight in person. Thank you so much for being here. And I think there were about 600 folks who signed up online. So all of you watching at home, God bless you. Thank you for being with us as well. And let's just thank our panelists one more time for the wonderful conversation.
It was great meeting you. I'd love to
Now, if you will permit me to take advantage of some of that Judeo-Christian tradition that underlies some of the best work that America has done, I will quote someone. These words are not mine, but you may recognize them. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. For the measure you give will be the measure you receive. And the blessing of God Almighty, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with you all this night and always. Thank you. Thank you very much.